ask for clarification, just jump right in. I'm also flexible. I was sharing with Tien before this, I have probably dozens of variations of other FAP workshops on my laptop. So, so if you have particular needs, areas you'd like us to emphasize, to dive into, please share that with me as well. I'm not afraid to kind of organically change the flow and what we emphasize while we're here together today, just to make sure that you get as much out of it as you'd like. Has anyone done FAP training before, or is this a first? Okay. In terms of this training, you know, when we think about introductory FAP trainings, there are really a couple different levels we're trying to hold. One is that because the central feature of the model is you're using yourself as a tool for both evoking the client and for reinforcing change, it means that we need to dive into and find safe spaces in training and supervision to become familiar and comfortable with the places where we find most difficult to interpersonally engage. So most of the exercises that we'll do are not the traditional, you might do role plays, but what some of my colleagues refer to as real plays, that I'll ask you to, as much as you're willing, dive into your own personal content, your own experience of life, as a way to better get to know the nuances and topography of, you know, where are your limits and where are your personal growth edges that come up with clients. So I hope by the time tomorrow ends, you've got a deeper understanding of your own history and how it affects how you are with clients, that you can relate it a little more, this heartfelt experience, to what you're doing. And I know some of you have professional relationships with one another, but just to honor that there is a lot of personal disclosure. You know, we certainly can't impose or force confidentiality on anyone, but to just be respectful of the degree of what's shared as we go through. I'll try and give a number of options so you can decide what we cover. Almost everything we do will be something that doubles as an activity that you can do with a client. So if that's ever unclear or feels a little too self-oriented, one of the things I try to do is to really debrief that after each exercise of how it relates to specific client activities you can hold in mind. But if that ever feels uncertain, please ask me and I can share more information there. And the workshop is really conceptualized as a microcosm of what FAP interactions could look like with your clients. So the idea then is that to the extent that you leave here feeling like it's been a heartwarming or heartfelt space, or that you've had a chance to be vulnerable and authentic, that it's to get in touch with a stance in a new way that you might express in your clinical work. I stole the next two slides with permission from a colleague of mine, Aisling Curtin in Ireland. But just in terms of thinking about your potency as an agent of change, that there are certainly, I'm not going to try and over-lecture because there are certainly intellectual things you could learn about this, but if that were all it took to do what we do, then I'd give you some brochures and we'd all go home. It's more difficult to do the vulnerable pieces that put us in direct contact with our own patterns of avoidance, with our own patterns of what's difficult. I'm going to try and and so the model that Aisling loves to share is this idea of thinking of being in your comfort zone, what you usually share at a workshop. Where am I on the way people sing to? Stand over here. Oh, that's probably bad for filming. That's okay. Okay, I'll go over here. So thinking of, you know, our comfort zone where you usually share in a professional context, and the idea that we're not trying to sort of blow anyone out or sink everyone into despair of past trauma or something like that, but really thinking about considering for yourself where your edge is for pushing yourself to be more vulnerable here. while still caring for yourself. If there's ever an experiential activity that I propose or that we engage in that does feel too flooding, or that you would like to know alternatives for, please share that. And if you're comfortable sharing it in a group setting, because there are a lot of gradations that I've either developed with clients or in workshops before with supervisees that I think you would get just as much out of. So don't feel like setting a personal boundary of this is too much here is going to diminish what you take from this. So something I like to do for all workshops is just to take a few moments here at the beginning to jot down nothing identifying about a client, but to bring a specific client to mind that we could revisit before the end tomorrow or revisit at the end of today, just so that you could look back after having done this and ask any questions specifically tied to your own clinical work about whether or not this feels relevant. So I'll just give you a couple minutes. When I say a brief history, I mean this might just be a few key words to orient you so that when you look back later, you can think, that client, this is the one I'm struggling the most interpersonally with. This is who I would like to think about. You might consider or also take a few notes on therapeutic interventions you've tried that don't seem to be effective or helpful so far. And a few words in your thought of what's going on, of why this is so difficult with your client. And so I want to do a sort of opening meditation. So you could close your eyes if you'd like for this, or simply gaze softly at the table in front of you. And I want you to give yourself a moment to just envision this scene as I describe it to you. This is from an excerpt from a book by Tara Brach. So Mohini was a regal white tiger who lived for many years at the Washington, D.C. National Zoo. For most of those years, her home was in the old lion house, a typical 12 by 12 foot cage with iron bars and cement floor. Mohini spent her days pacing restlessly back and forth in her cramped quarters. Eventually, biologists and staff worked together to create a natural habitat for her. Covering several acres, it had hills, trees, a pond, and a variety of vegetation. With excitement and anticipation, they released Mohini into a new and expansive environment. But it was too late. The tiger immediately sought refuge in a corner of the compound where she lived for the remainder of her life. Mohini paced and paced in that corner until an area 12 by 12 feet was worn bare of grass. Perhaps the biggest tragedy in our lives is that freedom is possible, yet we can pass our years trapped in the same old patterns. Entangled in the trance of unworthiness, we grow accustomed to caging ourselves in with self-judgment and anxiety, with restlessness and dissatisfaction. Like Mohini, we grow incapable of accessing the freedom and peace that are our birthright. We may want to love other people without holding back, to feel authentic, to breathe in the beauty around us, to dance and sing. Yet each day we listen to inner voices that keep our life small. Even if we were to win millions of dollars in the lottery or marry the perfect person, as long as we feel not good enough, we won't be able to enjoy the possibilities before us. Unlike Mohini, however, we can learn to recognize when we're keeping ourselves trapped by our own beliefs and fears. We can see how we're wasting our precious lives. I'd like you to consider for a moment what your own 12 by 12 is. Where are the places that you've become accustomed to pacing inside the cage? Are there things that you recognize that you do that keep you in that 12 by 12? So I want to invite you for a moment to jot this down. We're not going to do what it says on the slide. We're too small a group. In larger groups, sometimes what I like to do is to, we'll lay them out anonymously, so that people might see. But I want you to consider just reflecting for yourself for a moment. If there's something as we consider, and it could be personal or professional. And I'd invite you, if you're willing, to share with the partners at your table, to the degree that you're comfortable with it. What is the 12 by 12 that occurs or recurs in your life? Okay? Yeah. So, what did you notice as you do this? What do you notice about this in terms of, oftentimes the thing that comes to mind first is the thing we talk about least, especially in professional circles. But what did you see? Did you see yourself in your table stories? Did you see any thoughts?
I think what you were talking about was what others brought. We have a relationship already, the three of us. And what others brought was something that we wouldn't have thought of then. Mm-hmm. So what's my duty thought, I wouldn't have assumed that would have been heard to us as well. Or what the thought, I wouldn't have assumed either. So it's funny how people view themselves compared to actually what others around them would view. The disparity there is really interesting.
Yeah, definitely. The pieces that we kind of mask with our professional personas. Other thoughts?
I would be like with what Andrew shared, actually, to remind ourselves that we're human.
Mm-hmm.
Just kind of bringing the fact that, be a person, be a human, and actually listen to others.
It's we all have these non-obvious things we bring into the treatment group, or the treatment room, or with our clients. It brought to mind a number of years ago with a colleague at a conference where she's also someone who writes a lot, gives a lot of workshops, and I forget how we stumbled on the topic, but we realized that both of us in different ways a couple years before had had a concussion in different, sort of minor accidents, no serious repercussions, but we both had felt that same sense of like a taboo around sharing word search difficulties that affect us as each for various lengths of time. There are so many common ways that I think all of us might default. And so I'd like to start with this because I think just before we start diving in more deeply, it can be helpful to recognize that the things we're probably most nervous about disclosing as we start disclosing are things that are going to feel very shared, are things that are going to be reflected in the people we partner with. Before I jump into my lecture type slides on FAP, I wanted to just share a case example, because this will give us something to sort of hang a hook on, so that as I go through examples, I might refer back to, well, what did I think about this client? What did I do with this client? This is sort of a composite client that I had a private practice for over a decade in San Francisco, where it skewed toward working with chronic depression primarily. So for this kind of composite client I created, so a 48-year-old man who's seeking therapy after decades of depressive symptoms. He was in 2 serious relationships in his 20s and 30s, and described them as either emotionally or physically abusive. He recently reunited with his college boyfriend, who stood out as his one shining, brilliant, loving partner that he always looked back to feel like he was lovable through reuniting on Facebook. But after 2 years of quickly reuniting and getting married, there was a pattern of intense emotional abuse and behavioral control. And so he left the relationship, but was overwhelmed with hopelessness since. This is the thing I'd always held on to my whole life, that if I could be loved like that person loved me, I wouldn't be depressed. I could have a good life. That was dispelled. So He had relocated from the relationship. He had no friends, limited resources. He'd go to work and he'd go home. He turned down efforts to socialize by colleagues because they wouldn't understand what it's like to experience depression. And he presented as tearful and deeply sad. He had low hope for therapy and felt the rest of his life would just be working day to day, waiting to die. And he prefaced almost all of his stories of the week of his life with, as a depressed person, I felt this way when this happened. As a depressed person, this is what my days are like. Or he'd end descriptions of emotional experiences with, which is common for a depressed person. This was a very fused part of his identity. So I'm just going to file that away for now. As I start going through the steps of FAP, I'll refer back to that client. It's not important you remember all the details, but I'll remind you as we get there. So what are the objectives in FAP? So the idea is, how do we set a stage for a strong therapeutic relationship? How do we consider the relationship as the thing that we're able to manipulate? You know, we have two real threads or currents in our history of psychotherapy. We have the more dynamic models that say that this is something you're working and cultivating. And we have behavioral models that often neglect completely talking about the relationship. And there are studies showing that many cognitive behavioral therapists don't talk about the therapeutic relationship at all. How do we attend to histories of rejection? And what are the differences, or are there differences, between how we build closeness in therapy versus how we build closeness with our clients? So how many of you have been trained to, or have experiences where you feel fear about being yourself with your clients? How many of you were given the blank slate kind of encouragement in graduate school? The idea that your client should maybe, there's a Facebook group that I joined just because colleagues talked about how much they loved to hate it. TIPP, it's therapist in private practice. And so one of the most fiery recent threads, someone posted with pride that no matter how many years they saw a client, they stood by the maxim that when their client left therapy, they would know nothing about them or any of their beliefs in life. How many of you had that training or supervisors that said that? Yeah, I certainly did. So the important thing, though, is that we're humans in the world. A little slideshow. I just want you to check in with yourself. Like, what happens when you wake up in the morning, you're making, probably here making tea before you, but maybe coffee before you go to the office, before you start seeing your clients. I'm just noticing. The clickers kind of jump in one sec. So what feelings are evoked? What have you been going in the past year or two, especially after the pandemic, with wars raging? What do you go into the therapy room with? Just asking yourself, how neutral have you felt in this past year in general? How are you able to ground yourself?
It's quite funny, when you showed the photos,
Mm-hmm.
it was about probably 3-4 weeks ago, I was watching myself. When I wake up in the morning, the first thing I do is get my phone. I'm almost getting attracted to this bad news.
Yeah.
Because the media, every day there's something bad's happening. But this first thing at 7 a.m. How do I break that rule of myself to stop doing that?
Yeah.
It's so strong now. There's something bad going on that I have to get rid of it. So I've got to stop myself watching my phone in the morning as a trigger.
I forget the citation off the top of my head, but some cognitive therapist a couple decades ago had done a study of having people, sort of reminded by an alarm at periodic points through the day to just jot down what thoughts going through their head at that moment. And excess of 70% of those thoughts were negative in valence. There's an argument by many CBT researchers who do who focus on our evolutionary history of when you think about it, when you think about where our attentional control goes, we had in our ancestral lineage, small mammals that for hundreds of thousands of years were probably much more likely to survive if every dark shadow was hiding something terrifying, right? So we have this built in. We do seem to have a default response to gravitate toward the bad because it helps us protect ourselves from threat, right? We want to see where the bad news is happening. We want to know where things are most dangerous for us.
But I guess the question today is, are we bringing that to the rest of the day that our clients correct?
Well,
back in our backgrounds, something triggering us to do that. Is that correct?
I would add a twist to it, not just bringing it to our clients, but what does that look like to bring it to our clients? We could bring it to our clients in a way where the blank slate says we might act as if every news event that comes up with our clients is a dispassionate first hearing. We could pretend as if we're not bothered. We could lead as if this is something of no personal importance to us, even if it is. Or at the far extreme, we could be flooded, we could be emotionally melting down, we could be bringing it up with all our clients. So where do you find the middle place? And that's really the question. How do you hold some space around I'm a human and I'm affected? My clients, despite the pedestals they put us on, probably recognizes that I'm human and that I have emotional experiences about what's going on in the news, what's happening today. So can we create some honesty and authenticity around that? Yeah, are you agree?
Yeah, I was just going to say, what you mentioned, CP background theory about evolutionary theory and threat, quite routinely introduce clients, especially those avoidant of their emotions, normalize it for them more than anything, so because they often feel broken or damaged in some way, or that's a problem for them, and use it as a gateway into actually recognizing and facing emotions. But where to go from there?
Yeah.
It's something I'm curious about. So I've got ideas and I've got things I've done, but I'm moving there.
Yeah. Well, and it's a very evocative thing if you were to open a session saying, this occurred today, and I feel impacted by it. So this is something that may be weighing on me as we talk today, and so I wanted to let you know.
Talk together to relate to you.
It could be, or it could be, how many of our clients, if we consider that FAP, like ACT and like CFT is sort of part of this broader functional contextual body of therapies, all of these therapies to a certain extent have one goal in mind, which is can we reorient from all of the powerful stimuli inside of our heads to what's going on in the room. How many of your clients have intense interpersonal distress they experience because when they're seeking help, when they're looking for someone to comfort them, when they're looking for support in their own lives, they're focused on what their story means to them and perhaps even insensitive to the cues from the other person that they're not in a place where they could hear them, that they're not able to offer the full emotional bandwidth that they want. So we're bringing that into the room when we do that. It gives us something to work with. That, when I think of my clients who have the most disorganized styles of relationships, it's the ones where, you know, it's been eating me up. I want to tell my partner this, and okay, sure, so their father just went in hospital, but I'm going to tell them anyway. And I can't believe they didn't respond in a way that felt loving.
So I suppose pure CBT called that, or black and white thinking, or something like that.
Yeah, that's part of it, though. Yeah, for now that works. Sorry. I'm gonna switch. It is, but there's such a lag. So I'm just gonna tap on the thing for now. So it is important to consider that our training lags significantly behind theory out there, even in psychodynamic theories and relational psychoanalysis. I mean, there's been a shift across the field in theory of saying, you know, we are people in a room. That the arbitrary, stereotypical responses that happen when people are disclosing something personally feel alienating. That people want us to be human, that people respond best to therapies when we're human. B.F. Skinner, who is really responsible for a lot of current waves in behavioral psychotherapy, wrote in his book, Walden 2, what is love except another name for the use of positive reinforcement, or vice versa? It's a little simplistic, but still, it's that idea that we shape one another's behavior through engaging in a loving way. Okay. So it's important to consider a core feature of FAP as natural reinforcement. The natural reinforcement is not, I always think of the stereotype of like the behavior therapist decades ago that sort of, you know, cram a Skittle or an M&M into a kid's mouth right after they do something that's an appropriate response. No. Anyway, I'm going to do the thing. There's a lag, and then I don't know where I am. Okay. But in functional analytic psychotherapy, we're really trying to use ourselves and our own authenticity as the tool of reinforcement to shape behavior. So for a little bit of history, FAP labels itself a neo-Skinnerian approach to considering the therapeutic relationship. So built on Skinner, but not restricted to what Skinner had written. So they start with we start with the basic tools of a functional analysis or a behavior analysis, and apply them to understanding what's the interaction happening between me and the human being in front of me right now. When you think way back to your learning theory courses on reinforcement and punishment and contingencies of learning and stimulus control, how do you apply that just to you and me in a room? It's a close cousin of acceptance and commitment therapy. It's not COVID, it was lots of cigarettes at Lisbon Pride the other night. So it's a close cousin of ACT. Actually, the co-founders of FAP, Bob Kohlenberg and Mavis Saya, Bob's daughter Barbara, studied under Steve Hayes, who created ACT. So if you've gone to an ACT workshop and there's overlap, that's probably why she invited them to hear him talk before he'd written his book, and then that inspired Bob and Mavis to write their book about FAP, and so these things are all kind of closely overlapping. But it started, the line of research that Bob and Mavis were doing, started as an attempt to better understand the idea of a master clinician. So one of the puzzles that's bothered psychotherapy researchers for decades is that when you look at the history of psychotherapy research, even though you get this sort of regression toward the mean when we look at large-scale studies that are trying to compare what's the best psychotherapy, typically the founders of these therapies have phenomenal stories and well-documented ones of people who went to them for therapy and really thrived. It wasn't just that they no longer met criteria and the recent ICD code that they qualified for. It's that they actually experienced a life that was richer, that was fuller, they made major changes. And so this is what they were attempting to understand. With an emphasis on the idea that moment-to-moment behaviors in a session might be the key, that the reinforcement through natural closeness might be the core task of a therapist. There's a great study published by Truex in 1968 where he randomly gave little transcripts from different sessions to a pool of therapists to have them rate, is this person contingently reinforcing the client, and what are they reinforcing them for? There's high rate of reliability. They all agreed, okay, when you look at how the clinician's responding, he's only actually particularly enthusiastic when they're talking about growth, talking about closeness, talking about human value. And then sort of the punchline and why this got published was that every transcript he used was just from a different published transcript from Carl Rogers, who was, of course, the person who promoted the idea of unconditional positive regard. Even he appeared to be contingently responding, only most reinforcing those things that promoted closeness. So what are the assumptions of FAP? Well, we assume that it is a behavioral therapy, so the focus is not on insight. So our clients might say, as they think about what happened in session, I'm tying it to this history and these things that have happened to me, but that's not the goal of the therapy. We're trying to think in terms of always reinforcing a new behavior, always reinforcing and following or tracking those behavior changes to see if they're changing in the trajectory that we believe we're reinforcing, because if not, then we're not doing that. It rejects the notion of transference, because from a behavioral lens, you're two people in a room. This is always behavior that's in response to stimuli in the room. So in fact, we consider that it's always a real relationship, that our histories have led us to learn certain things, but our clients are always authentically responding to us in the moment. And so it would be considered counter to the principles of FAP to maybe take a stance like in some dynamic approaches of saying, I don't think you're responding to me. I think you're responding to something else. FAP says they're always responding to you. So it's a heavy lift for a therapist. It's present-based. So the idea in contemporary behavior therapies is that, yes, our past affect us, our childhoods, our traumas, our health history, but they affect us to the degree that we're feeling them right now. They affect us to the degree that we're having them evoked right now in this moment. And then the ultimate emphasis is on contingent responding. So it's the degree to which we're able to quickly and efficiently respond in a reinforcing manner to signs of growth in our client, that we're tracking these systematically to see if we did, in fact, reinforce, if that behavior increases over time, or if the things that we believe are reinforcing are punishing for this client. So an example could be if you have found that with many of your clients, sharing elements of your history can be very reinforcing and could lead to greater vulnerability on the part of your clients that's generalizing outside of the room, you're going to encounter a client where they will feel overwhelmed or flooded, or the emotions might feel too intense if you were to start disclosing too soon in therapy. So you also want to track your own behaviors. Because at its heart as a behavior therapy, we're really thinking about our own stimulus function in the room. What are we evoking or eliciting? The difference between eliciting and evoking is really if it's classical or operant conditioning, which 50 years ago behaviorists would really argue about. No one really cares these days. So the important thing is just to consider you're having an effect on your client just by showing up. Does it evoke a certain behavior? If you're late, if you appear disheveled, if you seem overly tired, is there a behavioral response to your gender, your physical appearance, your attire. I've had colleagues where we've realized in consulting on cases that, Tien and I may conceptualize a client in exactly the same way, but it would mean something very different for a client if both of us were to either be very assertive and really push, no, I'm worried about you when you do this. I'm wanting to ask, it would be important to me. If you wouldn't try this, Tien could get away with that. I'd probably seem overly aggressive. And if Tien tried my teddy bear style of FAP, it would probably all be completely too soft and no longer feel authentically reinforcing. And we also want to consecrate client behavior. So like most contemporary behavior therapies, we don't put a lot of emphasis on the idea of punishment. We know that that's not nearly as good of a way of shaping or modifying behavior as reinforcement is. But we might still consider how to block a behavior. So, let's see. In the example I gave before of the person who was always saying, I felt this way at the end of the day, as depressed people do. Or, well, I'm a depressed person, so obviously when this happened at work, I felt this way. Do you think that that makes other people feel closer or further away from him? If you had the knowledge that he also spoke like this in his day-to-day life? Further away. So how would you block this in session? So some ideas could be, it felt distancing to me when you said it this way. Would you be willing to retell me what happened without describing the clinical language? Would it, you could try softer if you're newer to a client and you're gauging their capacity for blocking, simply reflecting the emotions and asking more about those. So we want to, we'll get into more examples, but really the functions will have their strongest effect on in-session behavior. The idea in FAP is not that we're focusing on homework. If you go back a few decades, CBT protocols for interpersonal difficulties are all just kind of, we're going to talk through at a meta level, and then here's a worksheet of how to talk through, or go over your dear man points in your DBT group or something like that, which can be helpful, but you also have someone in the room responding to them. Are you responding to your client's request? When your client makes a request like, could you meet me at this time that you're usually not in your office? Or could you call my psychiatrist for me because they're not listening to me? You want to hold space for the idea that this has a very different reinforcement history for all of them. Is this a client where there's profound difficulty in expressing a need, and you might feel this is a wonderful opportunity to reinforce that, even if it's something you wouldn't typically do? Or is this someone who is routinely violating or crossing their personal boundaries, where it would feel important to say no? So there are only a few kind of jargon pieces to FAP that are important for conceptualization. The most common language you'll come across in articles or reading that's helpful is the reference to a CRB1 or a CRB2. The CRB just stands for clinically relevant behavior. So our first task is always in beginning to attempt to differentiate for this specific client in front of me in this specific moment, is this a clinically relevant behavior? Like I just said, the example of someone asking to meet at an atypical time, who routinely avoids asking for their needs to be met, it's a very different function, or that behavior serves a very different function than the person who routinely violates boundaries. This primary shorthand of just beginning to think about the classes of your client's behavior in terms of, is this an improvement or is this a signifier of a problem behavior? There are some approaches to FAP that really emphasize the idea of just closeness or further away in the relationship, which could be a good shorthand, though you'll probably have more effect on your client in their life if you're thinking more broadly about if it's a problem behavior or if it's a behavior that expresses improvement in the room, so we could work on them on the spot. FAP is not a therapy that really emphasizes the idea of like hashing through past events or events of your week, unless it's serving a purpose that we can tie to in the moment behavior. So for example, over today and tomorrow, we'll do exercises that involve looking at your past, looking at your history, but it's based on the idea that there is affect that's linked to that may or may not be difficult right here in this moment to convey. That there are probably topics or emotional states that are difficult to experience or sit with in a professional space. So even though we talk about the past, the content is not actually what we're working with in FAP. Content could be anything. Is this all old hat so far? Yeah. So it's also important to consider that client problems can be observed and reinforced directly by the therapist. So reinforcement's occurring whether we're aware of it or not. Really one of the core drivers for the development of FAP is the idea that we're probably shaping behavior all the time and inadvertently encouraging or reinforcing problem behaviors in the client's life. The client that we over-acquiesce to because it just feels easier after a long day to say no. The client that, and it's also important to consider that our clients are shaping us as well. Our clients have already established patterns in their life that reinforce others acting in the ways that they most expect other people to respond. And so if we're not tracking this, if we're not thinking systematically about what we're doing, this is still all happening. It's just happening outside of our awareness. So FAP boils down to 5 rules, 5 key principles that drive everything you do from there. The 5 rules are watching for CRBs. So if you're not doing that, if you're not trying to discriminate, then you can't reinforce contingently. To evoke CRBs, if you don't feel like you're getting them, and this is the role of different intervention tasks, like having people share losses with you, or having people asking someone an evocative question, like what would you be most scared to share with me about what happened to you this past week? Without those sorts of functions, then we're not going to get a strong sense of what the CRBs are. The third rule is to reinforce CRB2s with our own natural warmth and kindness. The fourth is to notice the effects of our behavior. So remember, it's one of those slippery things in behavioralism that a reinforcement by definition is something that has then increased the frequency of that behavior later. So it doesn't matter if it seems like it felt good in the moment, it doesn't matter if it felt appropriate. If our client doesn't keep doing the thing that we just responded to, feeling we were reinforcing it, then we didn't reinforce it. And then we want to promote generalizations of these changes within the therapeutic relationship in their outside life. And there are a number of tasks we might do to do that we'll cover. I also have more recent publications, or if you've read a more recent book on FAP, they sometimes talk about the awareness, courage, and love model, which we'll see if it has staying power. This is a model that sort of refers to 2 things. One is the idea to kind of come up with more approachable mid-level terms. So rather than talking about CRBs and a functional analysis, the idea that perhaps it would be easier to train if we just encouraged being aware of what's going on in the room, being courageous to do difficult things or lean into the difficult topics with a client. I always used to tell my supervisees, you know, when in doubt, keep it awkward. But could you be courageous about keeping it awkward in the therapy room? And then could you respond in a therapeutically loving way? There's a lot of research and sort of controversy about whether or not that's a good way to learn FAP right now. I can talk about that, or I can gloss over that. I don't know, where does that fit people's interest level?
How do you do it?
Yeah.
I stick to the old school functional way. Yeah, there's, because I'm one of the few academics that are out in the FAP world, I review a lot of articles, so I know there are a lot of studies in the pipeline looking at, are people who are trained that way able to have as strong an effect on a client as someone who's trained this way? I shouldn't steal anybody's thunder, but those papers will be forthcoming. And Glenn Callaghan, who's an early researcher of FAP, and we'll talk about some of his work later, you may start hearing talks for IBT, or interpersonal behavior therapy. And he's very transparent that it's basically just this version of FAP, because he's annoyed that there's a lot of writing on that side, and he feels like it completely loses the heart of what makes this an effective approach. So that's where I stick. I stick to those rules, and that's what we'll focus on here in the debriefing, things like that. But it is always helpful to have a vocabulary we could use with our clients that's maybe less technical. Fundamentally, the principles of FAP scale from basic behavioral principles that are pretty well established, but you know that typically doesn't fly for any definition of an evidence-based therapy. There are a number of case studies and publications on what it can be used for and effective examples. There are a smaller handful of actual treatment trials, including using FAP as an adjunct to cognitive therapy for depression, showing that you get significantly greater improvement. But the number of these studies is admittedly quite small. So while it's all promising, there's not a lot. It's a difficult, and particularly when you think about the 5 rules model versus the ACL model, it makes it particularly difficult to study, knowing that a CRB1 or a 2 for one client will be completely different and maybe even overlap in the opposite direction with what they are for another client. There is literature, however, that CBT therapists just rarely or minimally focus on the relationship in session. So it is important to consider that this could be an adjunct to anything that you're doing. Let's see, I kind of glossed over this already. Yeah, ACL, just an attempt to be more digestible, yeah. So, when we think about how to identify and start thinking about 1s and 2s, how do we watch for these and how do we identify them with our clients? Sometimes the most helpful place to start is to think about our clients' responses to unwanted experiences. So, asking ourselves the question, how does my client respond to their feelings of sadness, to their feelings of rejection, to their feelings of loss, or to their feelings of joy, to their feelings of connection, to their feelings of love? Many of our clients who come in who struggle with relationships, it's not that they have no loving others in their life, but to a variety of extents they can't feel it, or it doesn't seem like it can get in. So some of these responses might be considered diagnostic symptoms of their behavior, so ruminating over interactions in the day that evoke shame, leading to isolation and not leaving the home on weekends or evenings, discontinuing our pleasurable activities. We could start to check off some categories in the DSM or the ICD. But some of these responses aren't going to be symptoms that are so clearly labeled. Not answering the phone from our friends anymore, in the absence of some of those other symptoms. So they might include behaviors that we use to numb or distract from internal experiences. Like, you could certainly drink alcohol to numb yourself without crossing the threshold for a substance use disorder. Finding partners for sex as a means of self-soothing, if you think about like hookup culture. So they don't, and these don't always need to be problem behaviors. They could be adaptive or avoidant depending on the context. So we're always trying to look at, in this client's life right now, and the way that they're responding to this emotion, are they doing this as a way to adapt with the best tools they have? Is this actually the closest proximity to a workable, healthy life? Or is this about avoiding something or shutting off a difficult experience in a way that's not workable for them? I often think of, in the US a few years, probably 5 or 6 years back, there was a lot of media attention around the idea of sex addiction. I think this was like one of the dozens of times David Duchovny went into inpatient treatment, and there were a lot of interviews. And so I had a number of clients who came saying that they wanted therapy because they thought they had a sex addiction. And almost none of them would meet any of the proposed diagnostic scales. They might have had shame around a sexual encounter they'd had because it didn't fit their values. It was either sex outside of a relationship or sex with someone that they realized was not a person that fit their values. It was very, very rare that it was someone where the behavior itself was what was having a destructive impact on their life. I did see that too, but it was definitely the minority experience. Otherwise, it was, for most people, it was just, I have this feeling in this context, and I want that feeling to go away. That feeling feels so problematic that I think this is a problem. So, when we think about the example I gave at the beginning, the chronically depressed person who's constantly describing his experiences in clinical language, who has this history of abusive relationships, what would you start brainstorming as ones or twos might be that you would want to hypothesize or to watch for?
Mentioning that he's depressed, you said that frequently to everyone.
Yeah, frequently self-labeling as a depressed person. Telling you about or describing anecdotes where he's doing this outside of session with work colleagues, with friends, and acquaintances. How would you respond to it as a CRB? How would you imagine blocking that behavior if this were your client?
Just I'm noticing, this is what you start by saying, I'm noticing that your kind of language you're using, etc.
That may work. We'd want to track, does pointing out when it's happening decrease it? Or, because the slippery place is that because this is someone that's constantly asserting it, there's also always a risk it could be reinforcing.
Yeah.
Yes, you've noticed.
Yeah.
You're noticing finally, everything's so depressed.
Like I said earlier, in certain labeling in clinical terms, getting to breaking down into the sensations, what they actually recognise that. So how do they feel, where do they feel, or do you can describe that, how did it pass, what triggered it, you know? So you're building up that awareness in situations that happen without actually attributing or learning, which you generalise into one opposite.
Definitely. Even in intake with clients, I always find it helpful. I always find it helpful generally just when a client mentions they're coming for anxiety, they're coming for depression, or these terms cover an umbrella of symptoms. Could you tell me your experience? But anything that blocks that, yeah. Sorry, I don't have previews up, so I don't know what all I put here. But what would you imagine a CRB2 would be? What would you want this client to come in and do differently?
have you treated thing to track other people's reactions to their responses?
That would be a really sophisticated CRV2, yeah, that he notices this is how people respond when I do that.
I'd be curious to know if not defining themselves that way just evokes a different response in them. Like, how do you feel when you refer to yourself as a depressed person versus talking about the experience but not calling yourself that? Is it correct or worse?
Maybe. It starts to get really heady though. Like now we're starting to get into the cognitive content. That would be my, how would you pare that down so you stay with just the relationship right here? Sorry, I'm pushing a little bit because part of the emphasis of FAP is we're always trying to use the relationship here, not questions that, or at least not initially questions that bring it to relationships outside of the room.
Would you just talk about your interaction with them, their impact on you and your impact on them?
Yeah, you could ask their impact on you, but also what's happening. Probably should be them running over that. Oh, okay. And yeah.
This is where I get a little bit muddy, and I don't want to muddy the water too much.
No, muddy.
When you reference act and fact purge,
Yeah.
cousins of each other, so I'm trying to marry the two together.
Yeah.
And I often find myself falling into like using act to recognize their behaviour. It's like using the matrix, for example, still. So when I get confused with CRV2s, I always interpret it as being akin to towards use. And until they actually demonstrate or signify what the towards movement looks like, I get a bit confused. I have an idea of what I think would be useful, but actually seeing them both and bring out themselves gets a touch hard. So CRV2s, I feel okay finding those, but in terms of, I usually interpret it as being the exact opposite, so that would be the useful behaviour self, but whether or not they actually manifest it is another one, and I struggle sometimes to have them organically generated as opposed to me suggesting something, because I don't want to be too didactic in my approach, but at the same time that's where I struggle.
Yeah, there is, and this might be something that's gone over tomorrow. There's a trainer, Benji Shundorf, who's done a lot of work on, and has some online videos where he emphasizes using the matrix, but making it FAP. So you might call it a towards move. For those of you who don't use the matrix, we'll cover it later.
Sorry.
But for using the matrix in a FAP context, it would be the top left quadrant where it'd be I'm labeling all my behaviors as depressed, or I'm pointing out frequently I'm depressed. On the one hand, just like in compassion work, when you integrate FAP into this, we're kind of putting an a priori value in the bottom right of it, of saying you want to be connected, you want to have authentic and meaningful relationships. And so then what would that look like here? Like, what are you conveying? Are you, you could ask, when you describe your depressive symptoms, how did you feel when I responded this way? Is this the response you want? Getting to, this is that shared act theme of workability, of pragmatism. Is this what you want it to look like? What are you wanting it to look like? Can I invite you to tell it to me a different way? We can see how it feels. And so those are the ways it would look when you, because it's really kind of act just really, really zoomed in.
I'm getting confused. I feel like I'm getting confused with this. But so for the CRV2s, that is the diffusion work, correct? You're diffusing the client away from this being fused with I am depressed, that is who I am.
So I also teach like a year-long basic like learning theory course. So I'm like, how specific? Yeah, it's subtle. Yes. So the short answer is yes. Like on the one hand, getting them away from that is diffusing. But the point of it is not, in a FAP frame, is not just diffusion or getting them to take, that thought less literally. the point of it functioning between us is, can you feel, like the client feel, that it feels different how you respond when they don't use that language? Can the client notice that they feel different, or they feel more connected when with other people in their life, when they talk differently? And so in the grand scheme of things, that attention to labeling their internal states and noticing the felt sensation of closeness is going to reinforce confusion. And it's going to weaken that verbal behavior. But they're sort of like overlapping.
So is it basically the CRB2 is like you putting the client's volume in the here now during the session?
Yeah, it's all just what's happening right now. Any other CRB2s you want to see with this client?
Sorry, can I ask a question?
Oh, yeah.
You mentioned earlier where you're not sure whether the behavior is CRB1 or CRB2. To be able to discern that, what are the types of questions you might ask?
So, there are sort of two answers for this, because the first place I'd go would not be to ask, but to, it does require a lot of trust in yourself and your innate humanness. Did I feel put off by this person in this moment? Can I trust that this might be something other people feel? And maybe it's more specific. Maybe not all other people, maybe other women, maybe other men, maybe there are other ways that you're socially different, that the client's not aware of their impact. What are all the ways that you're willing to invite in of treating yourself as the compass of how you're going to respond? So I would start there. It can be very evocative for a client. Remember, rule 2 is evoking CRBs. So if you're watching for them, the next step is to evoke. So if you're not sure if it's a 1 or a 2, you could say, when you just said that to me, this is what happened in my body. This is, my heart clenched, my stomach fell. It felt very cold between us. What happened for you? So that could be a way to evoke. If the client is caught off guard by that tells you a very different story than if the client says, yeah, I also felt very distant, but I don't know why. Or I always feel confused when this happens. Or, it could go a lot of different ways. In terms of questions, then often, I'm sort of like a card, the hand face up on the table kind of therapist. So the idea might be, as you've gone through this, or as you describe this thing, that maybe it's a behavior that doesn't kind of correspond well to what you're doing in therapy. I could share, I'm not sure if this is something that's working for you or not. Would you be willing to do some experiments with me? One of the core homeworks that we often give in FAP is a risk log. This is also something that trainees are typically invited to do, that have a slide for the end of day homework, so you have a preview to encourage you to consider a risk to try this evening, but to consider an interpersonal risk. And by risk, we mean something that feels emotionally risky. What would feel slightly beyond your comfort zone to do in a relationship right now? If 10 is, I'm going to be flooded with shame no matter how it goes, and that's overwhelming, and a 1 is maybe a hair past how I'm already behaving in my daily life, then what would a 2 or a 3 be that you could be willing to explore and try and do each day this coming week? So I might assign something like that to a client so that we could explore how these go, what the response to those behaviors is. So homework could be a part of it. Yeah. Let me see, where do I go now? And so naturally reinforcing. So the client does do it too. He describes his experience without talking about symptom language. He feels authentic, meaningful, you're moved. How do you express this to the client? What's most natural for you? Some of us are some of us emit a lot of nonverbals that our clients, you probably know if you do because your clients have commented on. Notice this. Oh, here's an embarrassing, maybe it's a FAP failure story. So there's a principle, okay, I'll tell this story, then we'll stop for a break. There's a principle in behavioral training of I think it's the LSR, like least significant response. So the idea is, if you're not going to punish a behavior, but you want to be sure not to reinforce it, you just breathe for a second, you don't respond, and then you attempt to evoke again. You attempt to evoke something. And I had a client I was seeing, had a pretty high-power professional job, but had recently taken on a new duty where they had to go before a judge in closed chambers every couple weeks for hearings related to clients being detained. And this person had a very long habit of, when he was nervous, he would sort of burst out in this really high-pitched kind of forced laugh. and he was doing this in court. And the judge had started to threaten to bar him from the court, which would have severely limited his progression in his career, or to impose steeper penalties. And so in session, what I would try to do is I try to not react. You also don't want to laugh along. It would often come up at very painful moments for the client, or disclosing very shameful experiences. So I'd wait a second, and then I'd ask, what were you, and we both knew sort of the function of the behavior, so the idea of like, let's go back to what you were feeling, you were trying to block. What was the feeling before the laugh? Was it shame? Was it sadness? And then we'd go into that. So symptoms improved, therapy was going well, we terminated. A few years later, I got an email, and he said, I wanted to thank you again. I wanted to let you know that whenever I'm tempted to laugh, I remembered that I remembered that look on your face where you'd kind of glance down, maybe look a little let down. And that's what I hold on to. So we are always shaping our clients, whether we know it or not. So let's take a little break now. Watching for CRB 1s and 2s. So, and when we think about the function of someone who describes their behavior really clinically, the function is probably to not feel too vulnerable, right? The function is, it's many of our clients, you've probably noticed, can find ways to talk a lot about aversive feelings without actually having to feel the aversive feeling, right? It's the talk becomes the buffer. So if you conceptualize it in that way, the 2 would be any sign that you're seeing greater vulnerability, that you're seeing greater affect, that you're seeing. So these are things you might watch for. Up through lunch, we're sort of doing this, working through the rules to kind of dive a little deeper and end with an evocative activity. So in terms of evoking CRB2s, first of all, the treatment content is naturally going to be evocative. Asking a client, why are you here, is evocative. So for some clients, that's enough. You could find examples in the FAP literature, though, of in CRBT literature, or CBT literature, of anything from free association to agenda setting to discussing dreams to personal disclosure, all of this could be evocative. There are two philosophies, and I think I have this on a later slide, but I'll skip it when I get there. There are two philosophies in terms of the techniques we use and that we can borrow from other therapeutic approaches that Bill O'Donoghue in the CBT world has described. The first is theoretical eclecticism, which is when you attempt as best you can to kind of mash together the theory. And there are some elegant examples of this. Paul Wachtel, who wrote a book, Behaviorism and Psychoanalysis in the 70s, had a big influence on FAP. But the other is just to consider, if anything is fair game, if you're just trying to evoke and just trying to find opportunities to warmly reinforce, it doesn't really matter, well, so long as it's ethical, what you do in those boundaries. Our clients will often come in and say they have a dream that's been hanging in their mind all day or something like that. That all becomes evocative content. I often think of a classic paper, I think it was Cordova and Scott, on an attempt to come up with a functional analysis of what intimacy is, what actually makes something intimate. And they highlighted a few different features. They said, well, it has to be low base rate, right? If it's something that we experience with absolutely everyone in our lives, it's not intimate. So it has to be infrequent. There has to be a possibility for punishment. There's some reason in our learning history, some experience that teaches us that it's at least possible, if we disclose this, that we'll experience punishment. And then, what makes it most intimate is when it's received with warmth, where you take low base rate, high likelihood of punishment, and warm reinforcement. That's sort of the recipe for intimacy. So, disclosing a dream that involves engaging in incredibly taboo or unethical behavior that you receive warmly and maybe even offer a more connecting theme to, that would fit that model of intimacy. So we're always trying to come back to this idea of the role of goal. The goal of role 2 is to really find any way to prompt a CRB, but particularly a CRB2. You know, we would like to have opportunities to reinforce, and if we're not evocative enough, if our client for some reason just finds our style of engagement not enough to engage, to come up with anything meaningful, then we're not going to be able to do the work.
So,
Oh, yeah.
it almost sounds like going to confessional, but with like unconditional positive regard, in that what they're saying, you want them to say this shameful thing, you want them to say this thing that you wouldn't normally say because you anticipate a negative outcome, and then you give them the opposite, you give them that reinforcement. So am I thinking it correctly, or am I thinking it wrong?
Mostly, I would just add the caveat that, like, certainly we follow our ethical guidelines. There's, you would still report child abuse to the appropriate authorities. You would still, but the majority of our clients, what they feel shame around is not something that's a criminal act or something we might be concerned with. It's you know, something they did in childhood, something that was done to them in childhood, something that a desire or fantasy or a wish that feels inappropriate, that may or may not be in the general, you know, the consensus of the general public. So these are the sorts of things that so many of our clients come to us with. For those, this was, I think, before, just before you arrived, but with the opening Mohini exercise, many of you, it sounded like shared things that you don't typically talk with colleagues about, but it didn't sound like anyone heard anything that you would think of as criminal, as unethical, as worrisome. Low base rate is low base rate. There's a guy, Arthur Aaron, who does a lot of closeness research. If any of you saw the headlines a few years back of like the 36 questions to fall in love, this was based on his research, which is grounded in the same principle. And he escalates the intimacy primarily through manipulating the likelihood of rejection. So he prioritizes. It could be interesting if you ever like look up that list just to see what's in there, because in the first block, where it's supposed to be sort of the least intimate, but building it, low base rates cranked high, possibility of warm responses cranked high, but then likelihood of rejection is what varies. So the first tier of this 3 sets of questions involves questions like, what did you want to be when you grew up when you were 5? You could probably think of something, but how many of you have been asked that lately? Does your spouse know the answer to that question? Do your kids? So the infrequency being so high actually makes that a somewhat intimate discussion topic. Although, of course, the intimacy becomes deeper and more meaningful as the likelihood of rejection grows. I feel like I went on a tangent and I forget if I answered your question now.
No, not very good.
All right, great. So conversational prompts. What would be most difficult to discuss with me today? What are you most afraid to talk about? What's the most embarrassing or shameful thing that happened to you this week? All of these are things that at times I've had clients where we start each session. What was most shameful this week? What was most scary? What was most difficult? And go from there. So these are all things that are highly likely to evoke that response. And think again of that sort of 3 recipe mix, or 3 ingredient recipe of low base rate, high perceived risk of rejection or history of rejection, high likelihood of warmth.
Would you do that with any client? Like, could that be a question that you ask anyone?
You could, although because it's ultimately always an individualized plan based on the client's own functional history, not every client needs it.
Right.
Some clients, the evocative role of just walking into your office and, the ritual of sitting in the waiting room, flipping for the, 40th time through that Good Housekeeping issue from 1986, going into your office, that's already got them primed, and they're already there. So it might be so you could ask anyone, but it's probably more meaningful with the client who tends to want to lead with chit-chat for 15 minutes, or complain about the weather, or the heat on the central line, or whatever. So, always coming back to like what's most evocative for this client in this moment. Let's see, and like any of the other process-based therapies, it really means that any evocative technique could be used if it's meaningful to a client. So the overall philosophy, technical eclecticism. Oh, I think I went off on a tangent, but the opposite of theoretical eclecticism in O'Donoghue, technical eclecticism, which says if you have a strong overarching theoretical framework, you can do anything so long as you can make sense of what's happening in the room. You could do artwork, you could play with sand trays, you could do whatever it is that you personally are drawn to. Boxing?
Boxing.
Excellent. Although, I don't know, what if you bruise a client? Like that could be, maybe, anyway, that's, I guess, like, if you've got the pads and things.
What about like online therapy? Are there any activities that you recommend that transferable to a digital medium?
Online is, well, I guess, like, because all those questions were, but what's something, like when you're online, it's sometimes fun to take advantage of the thing. You can always drop a link in the chat box to a quick video, to a song. You could have, especially younger clients, though, I have even older clients that love this, sharing a YouTube link to a song they find particularly moving or that captures the thing they're having a hard time putting into words. That could be something that is easier and more natural to do via teletherapy than, I don't know, both pulling out your phones during a session, which could lead to a lot of other sorts of distraction. So,
I've got clients to stand up, to stretch, to show me parts of their house that potentially is evocative, to go to a corner and curl up and be a child, because that's the feeling I was evoking that moment. They can move around. They don't even need to see me on the screen. So it doesn't restrict you. You don't have to be in front of the screen. So
The pure purpose of it is to evoke.
evoke, exactly. As long as I know I'm evoking, it doesn't matter. I'm not restricted.
Okay.
Yeah.
and you could also, it's great for observations about the function. I think of a client I've seen periodically through via teletherapy through the pandemic, whose own mother died at a relatively young age, and she also, while still a teenager, became a caretaker for younger siblings, is quite successful now, still relatively young herself, and just had her first child. So when she talks about what being a mother evokes, or what it evokes about the relationship for with her memories of her own mother, how she relates it differently to her thoughts about decisions her mother made, just from a migrant family, so there was like sending siblings back and forth to live with family, or like waiting to migrate with. Having a baby in the room is really evocative. She'd probably have found a sitter if we were meeting in person, but the fact that that she's at home and it's teletherapy, and maybe it's maybe the baby requires attention. All of that winds up really creating a more intensely evocative space. So, yeah.
What if it's the other end of the spectrum? What if they're coming into the session so primed, so hyper aroused? Would you run with that? Would you just use it? Because I've got clients at the moment where it's really hard. Well, I'm finding it hard to work with them because they're so hyper aroused at that point. And it's just pure avoidant behaviour that I'm seeing in everything. I mean, is that just screaming CLB 1s and 2s to me? Is that what I should be picking up from it?
Yeah, it's, I mean, the function of a good wailing cry is often disconnection. You know, it's so you might, I think of clients where this has come up in session a lot, where you might try to the extent you can, or if a person is composed at the start of the session, or sort of waiting to fully get settled into the session to engage in behaviors that are sort of too behaviorally loud to get around, then it's also a matter of trying to work quickly. How do you want to evoke a different tone? You know, I noticed last session we were unable to talk. It was so overwhelming. Can we start with a meditation right now? Can we start with this? So it's not, because evoking is not about evoking an aroused state as much as just evoking a connected affective state, a connected state that's authentic and vulnerable enough that we can find twos in it. So if it's one big one you're facing, can you shift at the beginning? That might be one place I'd try.
Okay.
Thank you. Any other thoughts?
I've got a question, and
Yeah.
it probably comes back to sort of quarterback a bit, because it's so personal, right? And in terms of, and it's between the therapist and the client's relationship.
Yeah.
But based on who the therapist is, would really result in a lot of differences in that client, right? And so what you're thinking is just like, well, if me as a therapist or a coach, whatever, that I can only see whatever I see with my conditions, with my training or whatever kind of knowledge I have. But then how do we get to,
I guess what I'm trying to say is that obviously we want to support and want to help the client to increase their CRP2, but if I don't see it, or because of whatever background that I come from, that I don't see that CRP1, then I might lead them to a completely different path without even knowing it. Then I think like for me that would be like traumatized even, you know, like if say years back, later coming back to thinking about the client or something, I was like, oh my goodness, you know, like actually the CRP1 was this.
Yeah.
Then, I don't know, you know, not very clear, but.
No, it makes sense. I do a lot of trainings in translation. I do a lot of consultation across borders. And sometimes you don't even know what it is, but there's that kind of like flavor in the air where you know that like, I think I'm missing something cultural, or I think that my own cultural understanding isn't working in this moment. And in those cases, the evocative and vulnerable thing on the therapist's part to do might be to say, I know how this would work for me and in my social setting. Walk me through how this works for you. Could you describe to me how people respond when you engage in this way? Is this how you want them to respond? Is this, and so while it's, you know, from a purely behavioral perspective, while it's suboptimal to rely on verbal report over what you can see and feel in a room, it can sometimes be a helpful adjunct to kind of see, you know, am I on or off base with what's happening here with this person? Because it will always, you know, will always look different. There's that same shared philosophy with sort of contextual behavior therapies where when I work with culturally diverse clients, I used to work with a large migrant asylum-seeking population in San Francisco as well. When working with culturally diverse clients, when in doubt, I fall back and trying to look at, is the report I'm getting that this is workable? That the client's telling me that this different way they're behaving is working better for them in their day-to-day life or not? And letting that be a rule as well. We'll never completely know for sure. So, yeah.
Can I ask a question
Yeah.
on the back? What if the sort of the narrative that the client brings doesn't really match the consequence? The sort of the saying, you know, yeah, I'm trying all these things, but people are still responding this way.
Yeah.
And they perhaps lacking the ability to really track their impact on people. How would you kind of actually bring that up?
I would increase the verbal tracking of impact between us. So one of the earliest kind of assessments of how therapy is going that Mavis writes a lot about, just back in '91 in the first FAP book, is just, it's always helpful to ask a client, how do you think I feel about you right now? How do you think I felt when you said that? Letting that be the assessment. So modeling that tracking, that attention. Taking the sort of interpersonally risky step of offering when there's a discrepancy. When what the client's telling you they think you're feeling or seeing or how you're responding is pretty far off from what's actually going on in you. I often find it helpful. I'll talk about this in probably the last block of today. I'm going to talk about tacting, but one of the sort of core functional units that our clients often can benefit from building up is just labeling what's going on in them, and which is very closely tied, in my view, to that tracking of behavior and behavioral responses. And so the first step is modeling, right? So the first step is whenever I give a response, I'm going to walk through as specifically as I can the specific felt sensation in my body, you know, what I feel on my face, what I feel in my chest, what I feel in my belly, the emotion labels I attach to that, the meaning I attach to that, and then I will ask for a reflection. So slowly shaping their own behavior with a mix of modeling, of reinforcing, of evoking again and again. Because clients who, I think it's often the case that our clients aren't tracking well. But we always want to bring it back to how can we practice that tracking. You know, your session with them is the gym session for tracking that week. So how do we keep coming back again and again to practicing that tracking? Thank you. Any other thoughts? When we think about the relationship of connecting and warmth in and outside of therapy, I think this is where it gets tricky and where it's very helpful to have colleagues or supervision teams you work with when you do this sort of work. Because when I mentioned earlier that functional analysis of what intimacy feels like, that doesn't change when we're working with a client versus meeting someone at a pub, right? So this is why, despite lawsuits and ethical rules and guidelines and things like that, the number one reason that therapists are brought before boards, at least in the US, is through having intimate relationships with their clients. This is it's a difficult thing to be so close and so vulnerable and to maintain that line. So there's not a clear one beyond the a priori rules and ethics that, and our values we're bringing to it. That being said, we can reinforce vulnerability without with a limit of where we want to put it, right? Like you can reinforce vulnerability and intimacy and shape this behavior without even asking your client to tell you everything or every detail. We don't have to know every intimate detail of their life to do this work. And so sometimes monitoring the least amount that's workable is a helpful way to think about where we draw those lines. There's one of the places that I feel is very helpful from the compassion-focused therapy world is that Paul Gilbert and his colleagues have done a lot of work on the importance of recognizing fears of warmth. So clients who have complex trauma, who have histories of childhood abuse, often come to us with a sense that the more interpersonally vulnerable and warm we are, the more of a threat we begin to feel like. So it's important that you practice to be able to modulate your own warmth. And are always, this is why we have the Rule 4 on observing the impact we're having on our clients. Sometimes just a little bit is all that's needed, or is where we need to start before we start shaping to be comfortable in the setting of more warmth. And I think this also ties to work. Jonathan Cantor's done studies at the University of Washington Center for Social Connection, looking at the idea that when you explore and survey why people come to therapy to begin with, it doesn't matter if they've been diagnosed with a personality disorder, with something under a psychotic spectrum label. Excess of 60% of people say that they go to psychotherapy because they're lonely or because they've had a major rupture in a meaningful relationship in their life. It all comes back to, I think the major driver for most of our clients is connecting, and that's why they're coming. So our capacity to sit with that, to work with that, to reinforce that, is going to have an impact regardless of symptoms. Sometimes, and I'm guilty of this as well, we throw around the term therapeutic love in FAP in terms of creating that warm and embracing state. So it's just worth noting that if you don't have to use this term. If you're uncomfortable with this term, you're in good company. There's change in FAP. We're talking about responding and with contingent reinforcement to specific behavioral targets that occur close in time and proximity. that probably doesn't sound like what you wrote on the card at your last anniversary to a partner. So it is important to recognize that these are kind of different things, that while it requires you to be seen as a source of non-judgmental warmth, compassionate caring is going to look different. How we show caring, what it looks like, what we're comfortable with in the room is going to look different, and that's okay. It's not an excuse for unethical behavior. If via your experience with how clients respond to your physical features, to the common gender pairings in your clinic, and how those align with sexualities and presentation, you find that clients are responding to you in an overly romantic or sexualized way, then modifying the presentation of warmth in a different way could be one option. Or giving feedback, sometimes it's just always a one of the client to respond in an over-sexualized way. Criticisms have been published by Bill Follett, Amanda Munoz-Martinez, that the word love has a strong history. Its use as a training term may lead to confusion to you, lead to confusion to your clients. I once asked one of the founding people in the FAP world, do you ever use the word love with a client? And this person responded, not if I think they'd ever sue. So I don't know that I want that to be my rule of thumb. I've very rarely, I can think of one client that I've used the word with, but that could be a story for later. It also doesn't fully capture the FAP practices of differential reinforcement and shaping and punishment.
Can I just ask something a bit trite, but just in
Sure.
terms of communication between therapist and client in between sessions?
Yeah.
So just for me, a lot of it will be obviously email or text sometimes, and the language you use on text or the way you text a friend.
Very different.
Yeah, and I find that a majority of my clients always leave kisses at the end of their texts. Which, and I never respond, with this, but that for me kind of goes along that sometimes,
Yeah.
so it becomes more intimate and more kind of, I guess on a friend basis.
Yeah, and there are also huge generational differences in use and what emojis mean. And I think when we do that like between session communication, it can be really helpful to think as well about so what's your conceptualization of ones and twos with this client? Anytime you introduce communication between appointments, it's actually a really important tool just at the meta level of you're evoking behaviors of either over-reliance or boundary crossing or not. So it's a lovely opportunity to have that context set. But then what do you do with it? What are their how do you set the a lot of fear around me having upcoming travel and feeling sort of abandoned in a vulnerable time, but also not at risk of suicide, not non-psychotic, not wanting to interfere with, maybe it was my wedding. And so we talked through but this is also someone who it was really a two for them to express a need in a relationship where they feared that the response might be no, because it's so horrible that someone might have to say no, so you never ask something that could have been no. And so on the one hand, I wanted to reinforce it, but I also was not going to be writing the emails back. So we talked through, and it wound up being kind of a rule because it was quite a long time client. Going forward as well, which is you can always write to me. You can write whatever to me. You could share a success. You could share a fear. And I'm going to trust you to, you're going to trust me to read it. I'm going to trust you to explicitly let me know if there's a crisis that you want a response to, or if this is sharing. Because if it's sharing, I'm going to reserve the right to, to read and,
Yeah.
and get back to whatever. And if it's something where there's a need, you're feeling self-endangered, whatever the case may be, that you're going to flag that for me in this way. So I know that this needs a careful read and a response. And that seemed to be a good place where, that client then went on to never write that much, but really liked the idea that, okay, it's not off limits, you could feel connected and think that, and hold the thought that I'm going to read it when I get it. And I've already told you it's not a bother to me. We'll talk about these things when I'm back. And, we have it clear that I'm not always going to respond. And you could modify those sorts of rules in any way. It could be, I know we're of a different generation, and I know that it feels warm and close, and I want to let you know that I value our relationship and I enjoy working with you, and I'm never going to end my text to you with a kissy face. That's, how is that for you?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I have a question thinking about, so we have coaches here, and Andrew come from a corporate environment, and what you said is really important. FAP practices differential reinforcement.
Yes.
So in a corporate environment, we're not talking therapeutic love, so what would that look like?
So in a corporate environment, it's really, I would say think of the manager you've met who creates the climate of warmth and acceptance and encouragement and actually follows through on passing along the opportunities for you to grow and develop yourself. Think that kind of nurturing mentor role. It was a big thing. My practice was in San Francisco, so I had clients from all the big tech giants, and many of them, Google, Facebook, they had elaborate mechanisms to have senior people across divisions who would be mentors, who would have lunch with them, who would talk with them about what they're doing. So I would think in the corporate coaching field, it would be how do you embody and hold space and reinforce in the way of the person who knows? Because I know from my own experience as a therapist, even if you're not in that field, after enough clients, you know the politics, you know how this works. How do you embody the warm presence as someone who knows and is encouraging and caring about where they're going and supportive in line with the norms of the corporate culture? And when I say in line with the norms, I just mean no kissy faces and the emojis and stuff. Again, like I said, you don't have to use things like the word love to show a client, this is a space where I care deeply about your suffering and about your ability to be with it in a way that's going to allow your relationships to work. I think of clients where if disclosing that you've experienced sexual assault or mistreatment is something that feels like it's important because there have been difficult breaks in your marital relationship, you can hold space for that and walk around it. And that goes back to the idea that may not be something where it feels necessary or appropriate as the therapist to ask for any more details than that's between that couple, but you can hold space for and reinforce the importance that as someone who cares about you, I'm sure your spouse does, or it sounds like your spouse does from past history you've given me, I feel like it would feel meaningful to have this information. So there may be moments like that that also bridge the corporate world of when I think of you as someone I would work with that I could rely on, this is the sort of vulnerability that feels necessary. This is what feels meaningful. Does that all fit? Or any other thoughts or questions? Yeah.
just the notion therapy is that many of the clients that I've worked with, when I ask them the question, what is it about me that makes you open to discuss these things that you haven't discussed with other people? It's because they've got this preconceived notion of what I am as a therapist, so that I'm some kind of intellectual, that I've gone through some a heap of training or an expert in whatever field it's going to be. And it's that detachment of humanism in a way that they kind of use as a justification for being able to open up some. And that notion of showing therapists who are showing care, reinforcing positively, almost feels contrary to what they expected in a way. I was wondering if it was something you experienced, or if you address that misconception, or something you work on together, or how would you handle that?
Yeah, it's one of those things where you can talk about it as a part of informed consent, that you would like to incorporate these elements of therapy where you're engaging in an authentic and vulnerable level, and it may involve self-disclosure. And it will eventually come up that clients like that still don't believe you. You're being paid for it. You have your years of Bene Gesserit training to have no emotional responses to anything off-putting about anyone. And it'll have to come up again and again. And I think one way to undermine that is self-disclosure. One way to undermine that is, specifically if we're sharing about values, about judgments, about things we have difficulty with. I had a client who came in once where he was isolated and alone, and part of it was that he'd recently read the Bell Curve and had internalized a lot of horrible ideas about Black people and their intelligence, and was wanting to have conversations about this in his social circle in San Francisco during Trump's campaign, and this did not make him popular, or like anyone that was getting invited back to parties or called back, or and it was very clear, about my own political beliefs, about my disagreements, about my particular disagreements and dislike of that book, and
so you shared your opinions.
Yeah. But I said, and I see that you're lonely, and I see that you're suffering, and knowing that I don't endorse these beliefs, we can talk about, we can work with the loneliness, the isolation. Maybe we could find some ways, as we talk about the mutual effect we have on one another, what it's like to, what it could be like to reconnect with other people. Then you fast forward, and I signed up on work of going to a Trump rally, and he realized that they were awful people, and then he did a round of apologizing to his friends, and everything worked out. But that was a one-off. But yeah, it does come up though. It's no matter how many times you say it to a client, clients will say at the end of the day, this is why it's such a great question of asking, how do you think I see you? How do you think I feel about you? Because it evokes a client response like, it's your job to like me, it's your job to care, it really depends on the workplace setting. Sometimes it's easy to point out, it's not like I get paid that much for this, or this is a private practice and I have a waiting list. If I didn't want to work with you, I wouldn't work with you.
Okay.
I have fired clients. I could fire you if I didn't like you. That's evocative. What's it like to hear that I could fire you if I really didn't like you? So,
Have you ever used that?
I think once, I forget what brought it up. But I also, my own version of socialized medicine was charging employees from Google and Facebook outrageous fees, and then I had a homeless client who used to work in the mental health field before cascade of addiction and homelessness, and was aware of active FAP from a past training at a hospital they worked at, and reached out to me, and while still unhoused, and we worked out a sliding scale of, I think, he offered to pay $20 a session, and I said, can you continue to like feed yourself and house yourself as much as you can? If you do that, well, no. Okay, well, what's the level you can? Okay, we can do it for, it was $5, and then he got employment and got housed, and then it was 15, and then it would, but that's also helpful because it's evocative to a client that there aren't really strings there. There's not, there's benefit to a client realizing that this is, or being exposed to the idea that this is a relationship we freely entered, that, and that it's a relationship we could freely leave, with some ethical qualifications to that statement, but still.
It's interesting that you were mentioning, I suppose, on the guise of disclosure, offering opinions, or your more disposition towards something. So, because it kind of flies in the face of the training that I've had in previous professions, where you don't say your beliefs because it's leading, and like in teaching, for example, I would never say what my religious disposition is. I wouldn't say what my attitude towards sexuality was, and things like that. I would present these what people believe. This is what it is, and I'd be open to listening to and discussing it. So, but that notion of sharing, a preconception, sharing a moral standpoint. What I'm interpreting is that there's got to be a function to you sharing it.
Yeah.
There's got to be a point to it. So if I'm saying this is what you believe, I don't agree with it, but I'm open to entertaining discussion in the room. How do you feel about that? Are you comfortable with someone disagreeing with you? That notion of almost nuanced debate to a degree, that we can disagree but we can still have a shared space and we can get along. So, am I interpreting it right? Or?
Yeah. Like in this case, I just spoke because it was very clear that this that these racialized beliefs were at the heart of the interpersonal disruptions.
Sure.
And I didn't know yet, like one hypothesis could be that they weren't willing to sit in a room with someone who might not enthusiastically agree. I don't know what I want to be paid to like fake, certain types of responses. Then I don't feel like it would be helpful. So, but yeah, it all comes back to function. So like you use the example of teaching, like when I teach psychology of gender, which is there are a number of very heated topics today. So I might want to model, just like I would with a client. Here are two bodies of literature in this area that express how people disagree. Maybe if it feels appropriate, I could share, here's an area that I tend to be more swayed by. But it's all about the function in the room, in that context, with the roles that we both have and what we're both doing. Thanks. So within a lot of trainings and FAP circles, you often will just hear people talk about ones and twos. It's not that important to discriminate, but in the literature, often T1 or 2 is used to differentiate the therapist behaviors. And it's a little different because it's we're not typically thinking in terms of the therapist's own growth or toward or away moves as much as we are with this client, with this specific formulation. Is something a 2, meaning it's unique to that therapist, or uniquely reinforcing from that therapist, that when I am in this way, it is a 2 for a client, for this client, or a T1, which is this something that punishes the client's growth? And this is something that we want to differentially assess and make sure we're aware of with every single person we work with. Our 1 o'clock could be the client who feels like it's a caring, aware notion that we pass them Kleenex if they're crying. Our 3 o'clock appointment might feel that it's a covert message that we want them to stop crying already because it's off-putting. So we're always wanting to identify that. And it does require that we be comfortable with noting what are the emotions that are hard for me to sit with, what are the emotions that are hardest for me to reflect to someone else, what are the emotions that I might covertly be trying to avoid or steer away from with my clients.
On that note, sorry,
Yeah.
I'm just thinking about if you're working with someone in grief who's grieving and it's very, very emotional, obviously the same kind of thing, I was trained years ago that, you show nothing, you give nothing away, and recently I had a client who had been working for a long time who had a husband with terminal illness who passed away. So I'd kind of, within that relationship, I'd got to know, although I wasn't doing therapy with the husband, I'd got to know him, so I felt a loss myself, which, so, and I did well up. But there was a huge part of me that was like, I can't do this is so unprofessional, and so there's still that kind of rule that you can't let go, that you've got to hold it together. I'm not suggesting that you sit there and sob with them, but it's I find it hard with the line, I guess.
And I guess the difficult reality is that there's no line to point to and say it's only here. It depends on the client.
Yeah.
The client, their history, your history together. I could certainly imagine clients where, I've had long-time clients where their spouse comes to pick them up periodically, or, they're coming back from a trip, that you have a sense of connection with them, where if you found that person were dying, like, of course you well up, of course there'd be some feeling around it. And it's also, and this is why we'll do more experiential exercises as the day goes on, and this is where it's important to get in touch with our own grief. Is grief something I can be with without being overwhelmed? Is grief something I can sit with where even if I well up, I'm comfortable staying in this role and holding space for my client and still remembering to think about what I want to reinforce or what I want to block based on their history of engaging in their own hard emotions. So it's there's never the clear point.
Okay.
And I'd say the most important thing would just be comfort enough with particularly like negative valence emotions and feeling them in the room with someone that you are able to continue to function.
Thank you.
I was just going to say, would it really, really bad? You'd be crying with our client?
I don't think it's so bad to cry with our clients. Yeah.
I cried with the client for the first time like a couple of weeks back, and it really works, and I've developed a therapeutic relationship like never before have I shown emotion like to a client, but I couldn't help it. It was like particularly harrowing recount from themselves, and it just hit me. But it worked in that instant. So all my preconceived beliefs about like I can't show it, it's going to be wrong, they're going to read into it. So in this instance, it really works. So, but I think that's where I struggle with FAP a little bit. It's my understanding of the fundamentals, basics, the concepts of CRB1s and T1s and things like that. Because I was looking at T1s and T2s of like, how did I feel? What does it say about me? As opposed to what have I done that's had an effect on them? That's a pretty big mistake.
It's an important switch.
Yeah. So now I've got a much clearer understanding.
Because it's a T2 if the crying reinforces the client's own vulnerability and willingness to be that deep with you right then in the moment. So one of the clients that makes up the composite client I described who talks very clinically about his depression was one that I worked with for years, who since adolescence had been frequently hospitalized, and from the beginning of our work together would talk around an experience of having of having been rejected by a close friend they felt related to their depressive symptoms. But it was so dense with jargon and clinical language, and I barely even knew what was going on with this story. And so during one session, after we worked together for a time, and he was revisiting this, I just shared, like, I feel so disconnected from what happened, and would you be willing to tell me the whole story and to not use any clinical language at all, to not use any descriptors, to just tell me the story? And I think we needed to build the trust. This was at least many months into therapy, because it was hard for him through tears to like tell it in that way that he really had to feel it. But I was crying by the end too. It was so moving to hear what had happened. But then my response motivated him to share with some close friends that had heard the story, but only like the very clinical version, to share an authentic telling with them of what this thing was that he kept bringing up. And it was very moving with his friends as well, and it built this cycle of reinforcing that his relationships felt so much closer when he was willing to show what was really going on, to really be with the feeling. And I imagine I had that effect with your client as well. Hopefully. We'll see. Yeah.
So I'm presuming that we would find out if it was a T1 or T2 by discussing impact on the client if it wasn't obvious. But let's say I was sort of trying to figure out like something I thought would be a T2, it was actually a T1 for the client. And I was trying to figure out how to make it a T2. How would I go about doing that?
I wonder if you could give me an example. Like, what's the thing you're wanting to make a T2? Because I guess I'm thinking, like my knee-jerk response would just be, don't try and make it a T2, just do something else.
Okay.
Yeah, maybe it just won't work. Maybe if it's not clear, if it's all self-disclosure, it's not reinforcing to this client, but some types are, but these are like rare special gems of 2s you're getting from the client, and you have something else in your repertoire that could be reinforcing, then do that instead. It's not worth trying to force it. And I've mentioned disclosure a lot. I always used to tell my supervisees in my clinic that often the most powerful form of disclosure, self-disclosure we use with our clients is nothing about content about ourselves. Even though I'm obviously sometimes a fan of that, it's authentically sharing what we're feeling about them in a moment. So that is sometimes the richest source of self-disclosure that we're doing to begin with. And but yeah, if something topographically just doesn't seem to work to reinforce, then it's probably not worth too much effort to try and make it work.
Can I ask another question about that? What if a T2 that you want to do or feel comfortable?
Yeah.
For example, I had a client who wanted to continue working with me. I didn't really want to continue working with her.
Yeah.
So because I just didn't feel like the relationship was really working. I felt very disconnected with her. That's not something we could cross at all.
Yeah.
But for some reason she was feeling like it was working and she wanted to continue.
Yeah.
But what would you do in that instant when it's actually working for her, but I just don't feel like doing that?
Ideally, at an earlier stage, there might be opportunities to share when you're feeling disconnected, to explore the mismatch. That might be something really powerful for the client. Termination can be a rough time to broach that topic.
Oh, we did do that. It inevitably was an amicable termination, but I couldn't get over the sense that she wanted to continue because it was benefiting her. I didn't feel very comfortable with that idea.
Yeah. I don't think there's a right or wrong way there. It goes back to comfort with your own authenticity. and your willingness to, and your willingness to be with that interpersonal tension. What's it like for you to say, I don't feel a strong connection where another therapist couldn't be of value? Or does, I notice there's this mismatch that I feel like you seem more connected to me than I've felt in our relationship. Can we talk about this and see what it evokes, see what happens? Is this a historical one for this person, that they read a lot of affection and meaning into connections that aren't reciprocated or don't meet their needs? Is there a lot of persevering in relationships that aren't very rich or very deep? So all of those could be places I'd want to go.
That's really interesting, thank you.
It's also really common. I'd have clients come in, speaking of like response styles our clients want that we don't want to give, that it's very common a client would come in and say, I just want someone I want someone who's going to call me out on my bullshit, really, really tell me how it is. That comes up so often. And of course, my first thought is you're obviously struggling with a lot of self-criticism, and that's not my job to feed that. I want to meet that with some self-compassion. And so, but I tell them that, and usually they're okay to explore that if this could work. But
I guess that's where the therapist courage comes up, to be able to
yeah.
talk about it.
Yeah, our clients, if our clients always got what they were asking for, that's often what they're already getting in their life. If that were all that worked. But this is part of that awareness, courage, love moniker. It does take some courage on our part to be willing to say, this thing you're asking for, it's not just that I'm not comfortable giving it to you, but I don't think this is actually what you need. Let's see. I'm just going to go. You want?
30 minutes for lunch.
Yeah. I think it might be better to go to the activity and debrief. Okay. I'm going to kind of skip over this part. There's an article by Crystal Weeks and colleagues called The Logical FAP Interaction. I believe it's open access if you look online, or you could always email me after, and I'll just send you the PDF. But it's but basically the idea is when you really think through the 5 rules, to the extent that you can stay with them, it creates a cycle in each session of evoking, seeing if you get a 1 or a 2, blocking a 1, reinforcing a 2. If you've blocked a 1, then you're trying to evoke again. You're trying to evoke again until you have a cycle of 2s that you're reinforcing, where you can explore the impact and where you can brainstorm or generate ideas with the client about how they might practice that too. Did you notice how you felt when I responded this way? Have you tried this behavior with other people in your life? How do you believe that they'd respond? Would you be willing to risk that this week? And so getting into that cycle of what's called in these articles into-out reflections. Can you do the thing that you did in here with other people? And we'll come back to that next week. And so this is really ultimately this cycle of reinforcing 2s, generating ideas on how to practice this in the outside world, and then repeating the cycle over and over is all you do with that. And going down.
I find the process really interesting because it allows us to tune into some sort of truth. It's like, what are the lies we tell to ourselves? And as you repeatedly ask, well, what is the truth in this? And what's the more painful truth in this? It sort of just nudges you to sort of go past the reasoning and the justifications, to just go that little bit deeper, a little bit more
think that's what I was thinking as well. I think using the word truth kind of filters out everything else. And it's very sort of, it just creates the space where you're just getting down to what's really hurting and really vulnerable.
Yeah.
And that it's okay to tap into that. And I think the variations and the questions help as well with, what's difficult about this truth? How does it feel to talk about this truth? Can we hold this truth? I think even that as well facilitates that deepening.
And it connects you with the feeling as well. I could really feel it, whereas before I think I could say it, but I wasn't necessarily feeling it. So there's a connection, it feels stronger.
Well, and I thought this was good before lunch. It also cuts to that distinction. We all have, sort of the little slightly guarded ways we talk about our lives that function to keep us from feeling. What's the way to talk about it where we're deep in the feeling? What's the way to restate it where we're just right down in the mud? Yeah.
Something I noticed from your previous reel play that you did, and I think it's sometimes very difficult to try and get warmth and evoke.
Yeah.
How do you get that right balance? And I noticed there was a moment when you had a pause.
Yeah.
And when you talked about your chest,
Yeah.
and you felt something, and then it was almost like you paused. And was that a moment where you're going to ask the next question? What's the riskiest moment? It was almost like the transition. And why I'm sharing this,
Yeah.
sometimes I think we're very good at asking the language, the word, what is something else true about what you want to,
Yeah.
when we should be looking at the actual body and their body. So I noticed your moment, and I noticed when we had our conversation, it's not so much of what you're saying, it's when you touched your chest as well.
Yeah.
And you said about feeling tired. So it's something that's a lot
Yeah.
deeper than just the language of what we're doing to get that warmth. And that's what I learned that, and I managed to watch that focus on the body more than the language.
That's, we'd actually talked a little this morning. I wanted to sort of swap out what I had planned for the last quarter of the day to really emphasize the embodied piece and working with that, because I feel like it's so important to this. And it's true, as he started to describe what's going on in his body, part of the pause for me was, okay, this is evocative in a lot of different ways. And I see, in terms of thinking about different ways we could explore, there was really an exponential shift for me in that moment too, of, okay, holding this, where can we go from here? And what would make the most sense in this context, in this way?
I think that they're really useful actually, because body language is such a key, and you can kind of tell so much, just by watching their body language. But she also took her hand up and she's like, I feel it here, and it's like that in itself is just having so much.
So then how do you hold that? Like, what does it feel right now, in the moment? I think that's something I've learned this morning already, is about in the moment.
Yeah.
It's not what you said yesterday or tomorrow or whatever, it's now.
Yeah.
It's that language coming out.
Yeah.
I think sometimes we lose that.
Yeah.
So thank you for that. Your role play remind me of that, the more human part. Yeah.
That's like the whole other workshop.
Yeah. Well, and I have the client that I mentioned that I've been seeing in teletherapy. This is a client that we for years have started sessions, off and on when I've seen them, with a meditation, and even over Zoom, she has sort of a fluttery, shallow breath during periods of higher anxiety or less self-care. And I realized even on Zoom I can still see the top of the chest, if it does the flutter, or if the breath all can go in. And it tells me right away, before we've even talked, where she is in her body, where her stress is, where her bandwidth for self-care has been. And because of talking of that over the years, like as soon as we finish the meditation, she too will say, okay, so I know you saw I felt this part then and this part here, and so let me tell you how this context is been. And so we start with the body,
Thank you. Just help me to learn.
Should we go ahead and break for history with key points, losses, landmark events? The structure of it is that in your groups, you'll have 6 minutes. I'll ask that everyone just sort of allow you to speak, and then we'll rotate and I'll make announcements with the timer. You might have an opportunity to share a genuine reflection on what you've heard. If you feel done before the timer goes off, I'll ask that you wait and hold some silence for that moment. Oftentimes that might lead to sharing a bit more. But I want you to think about what are the vulnerable key points in life that really make you who you are, that you'd like to share. Obviously, 6 minutes, you've lived a lot more life than 6 minutes, so the goal is not to like rapid fire cover everything, but just those key things that you would like to dive into. Consider emphasizing those moments that have been under-discussed or under-rehearsed. Remember the low base rate of disclosure as a key part of experiencing vulnerability. What experiences shaped you that you typically hide, that you're typically afraid to share? Consider parts of your experience that might lead to avoidance with your clients, ones that you fear about going into because memories come up. Again, remembering that first slide about comfort zone and so forth, of thinking about, while I'm encouraging you to go to the edge of what feels vulnerable, I want you to check in with yourself too about not going over the edge for yourself. And it's primarily an opportunity to practice the first 2 rules, watching for or actually I disagree with what I put on the slide. I was probably tired. I think it's really rule 1 and 3, since you're listening and then having a chance to respond, which is watching for CRB2s, and then it gives you a chance to genuinely and authentically respond on how you connect with what you've just heard in a way that can be reinforcing. We're going to model this, Tien and I, in a moment. You might think back to the 12 by 12 exercise at the beginning, thinking about where you avoid. Let's see. For the listeners, I prefer you stay relatively silent, but if your partner seems stuck, feel free to consider a very gentle or minimal encouragement, or an encouragement to share a bit more, to slow down, or whatever might feel necessary. But use that very sparingly. Try not to take steps to fill silence, especially if you're a listener. Even if a speaker chooses to be silent for a moment, to collect their thoughts, to pause. What else came up? What else did you notice?
It was quite alleviating the way to go back and kind of almost like the pinball, put the strings to, for me, kind of what I'm struggling with at the moment in my personal life with disclosure and opening up. It's always nice to think back, what could explain as to why I'm like this, instead of that intimate frustration in the moment of, why can't I do that? I'm struggling with myself to disclose things or just to say what's on my mind. I very rarely then think back, of my life history to think what's brought me to this place, and it's nice to think actually there are reasons why I'm like this. And that's okay. And from where I was to where I am now, I've changed loads. Just to think bigger context, broader scheme of things feels a lot nicer within the moment to think, okay, that's something that I'm dealing with at the moment, but it has been well, it's getting better. There's a reason, and that's quite nice.
Yeah, there's something that's parallel in DBT and CFT, that they all emphasize this idea of the things that we often perceive as our biggest struggles now in our relationships and connecting, we came about them honestly, as they say. It's our history's shaped us, that this was the most adaptable, this was the most workable, this was the best thing we could do at the time. It just isn't now. But we got there in a way that was genuine, that made sense, that we didn't choose. Yeah, it like builds in compassion. Any other thoughts?
I like the timing part as well, because at least I don't do this in my practice. I don't think like, okay, for the next 6 minutes, you're just going to say, you're going to talk. But here it was quite powerful, because I needed to, like when I was listening to, I needed to sit with my own questions that was coming up, with my own wonders, and also gave space to the person say even more. I could always see like most of us would stop in the time like 4 minutes, and then she would be like, you can continue, and then a lot more would come up.
Yeah.
And sometimes was the important bit in the last college. So, maybe think as well the usage of time.
Yeah, I think it's evocative in both the way of the people who can easily talk for an hour. It forces us to choose and kind of get to what's meaningful. For those of us where it's hard to get those vulnerable words out, it's a challenge to extend it. But then the responding, this is our clinical skill, right? There's so much research in behaviorism that says that it's really just the first few seconds that we have to reinforce or punish something. If your therapeutic style is that you kind of warm up over a few minutes to tell someone why an interaction was meaningful, then you're probably not reinforcing anything, no matter how beautiful it is you get to in 3 or 4 minutes. So it's intended to kind of challenge you to think a little more tightly. How do I say now why that matters? Any other thoughts?
You'd be quite curious. You go for therapy, you've got three people helping you. The fact that it was nice that everyone's balancing each other for my problem. And it was just nice to have different point of views.
Yeah.
I'd like to have 3 versus 1.
Yeah.
But it was nice the way they were building on each other there. And I think sometimes when you're on a one-to-one, you lose that. Sometimes you don't know if diversity of ideas, questions or thinking. You've got that in this room.
Well, and the more our partners are willing to kind of dive into their own genuineness of how they've been touched and affected, it lays us out in a more vulnerable way to hear this side being reflected and this side being reflected, and so it helps us settle into our own truths. Any other thoughts?
Certain words that I heard that annoyed me more than anything. The word thank you was bandied around quite a lot. And oftentimes it was used as kind of start to give them feedback.
Yeah.
And this is my own personal experience, and it's not knocking anything else, but when I received it, it felt like tokenism. A word that was just thrown out there. It's supposed to have genuine meaning.
Yeah, the genuine stuff might come after.
The part that, yeah, exactly. And the parts that I found the most nourishing were the genuine statements. People telling me exactly how they felt.
Yes.
As opposed to what I interpreted as things that I would like to hear more than anything. But hearing their take on it, on what it affected them, that was far more meaningful than buzzwords, tokenism, whatever it's supposed to be. So cutting through the niceties and just getting to the core, raw parts, that was the most effective part for me.
Well, and I think especially if you think about sort of that 5-role model of FAP, and if you think about quickly reinforcing, that could be a challenge for everyone going back to a client of what would the quickest way be for me to move right into the part that's meaningful if a client does something that's really vulnerable. How do I get right there? Am I willing to go there first? And even if I have questions, put those aside so that I don't miss this chance to reinforce this moment. You could always come back later with questions. You could always ask them. But if a question is the first response, questions are rarely reinforcing. So. Sometimes, but not as much. Any other thoughts?
I always think the importance of silence. Yes. All of role plays, these group exercises within therapy, just the haste of wanting to fill silence can dismantle so much good work that's going on and reinforce the clients and my own T1 and CLB ones.
Yeah.
And it's just actually sitting with it, because when someone would come up and the table would be silent, the connection was so much stronger. You could actually feel that everyone was thinking, it was heard, which was lovely. Constantly reminded that silence has power.
Definitely. Yeah, there's that. We use words so much to just kind of buffer from the emotion. Anyone else know? So hopefully it's not the rain too difficult a midpoint of the afternoon to do this, but I want to transition into our next activity with a compassion meditation. And so what it will entail, this is a classic from CFT, the Compassionate Other meditation, where you are bringing to mind the image of a loved one and paying attention to the sensations in your body and what this is like. For some individuals, it can be difficult to imagine or to hold images in mind. If that's the case for you, there's actually even some literature that suggests that just having the intent of this experience as if you were able to picture someone that you're close to tends to have similar neurological and physiological effects, so you can try that. If you're someone where any part of this becomes aversive or feels overwhelming, feel free to just go back to kind of check in with the weight of your body on the chair, the contact with the floor, ground yourself, and it won't be that long a meditation, and we'll come back together and can talk about it. So I'd like to invite you to just sit in whatever comfortable, grounded way you're okay with for this. You can close your eyes if you like, or though if it's easier for you, you prefer, you could certainly just gaze softly at the table ahead of you. Beginning with a few diaphragmatic breaths, just to ground yourself, maybe in through the nose to the base of the belly. Exhaling completely through the mouth. Infilling the lungs bottom to top. And exhaling top to bottom. When you're ready, perhaps for the first few moments, just noticing the sensation of breathing, the coolness of the air as you inhale, the warmth as you exhale. And I'd like you to bring to mind whatever image there is of someone who represents compassion, strength, wisdom. Could be someone real, someone imagined. It might be a sense of presence, a deity, a saint. It might be that Someone human-like doesn't feel safe at all. It's a beloved pet. Simply seeing what comes to mind. If you don't usually do visual meditations, the image may flicker or drift between different objects, and that's okay. Don't struggle with it, just let it be. Picture the eyes of this being, the lines around the eyes, the tender look. And check in around your heart. What does it feel like to be in the presence of this being? To be looked at as someone who's completely loved and cared for? To be completely seen, all your strengths or your flaws? That this being knows everything about you, good or bad, and still just wishes for you to be happy, and is generating love for you. If you can even imagine light shining from their heart, touching every cell in your body, attempting to alight your own cells, your own self's desire to care for yourself and be happy. Noticing what this feels like around your heart. In your body. Bringing those eyes to mind again. Fully seeing you. Everything you've done, everywhere you've been. Only love reflecting back. What's it like to let this in? What do you feel in the core of your body? Allowing the image to fade. Just coming back for a moment to your breath. The coolness of the in-breath. The warmth of the out-breath. Whenever you're ready, opening your eyes. And what do you notice in this experience?
Honestly, I found it difficult to focus. It's almost place.
Yeah.
Give it a little wiggle when you phone left it in. So it's really connected. It's very hard.
Yeah.
In the moment.
Yeah.
It wasn't probably the right answer.
Well, there's no right or wrong if
There
you
is
were.
emotion though. Yeah.
Yeah.
It wasn't to relax, calm, peace. It's more like noise.
And this is, in FAP, if I were doing this with a client, this goes back to the importance of we track what we do. I think of grad students that might rehearse 15 times for a meditation and then not want to let go, that this would not be the right moment.
Yeah.
So, yeah. So, and because I think one of the core sort of behavioral pieces that doesn't get talked about a lot in FAP, but is a really important part of it, is this concept of tacting. And Skinner was very big on making up words. He would, just sort of took tact from words like contact to short, and he defined it as a verbal operant attached to a nonverbal stimulus maintained by nonspecific social reinforcement, which is a really elaborate way of just saying things that are invisible to other people. The butterflies in our belly when we see someone we're attracted to, the weight in our heart when we've experienced a loss, that learning to attach a label to that, and then having people around us that reinforce it, that's tacting. And when you look at the emotion regulation research, so much of our ability to sit with strong emotions, so much of our ability to cope with strong negative life events is through being able to do this, is being able to put a name to those sensations that don't have any objective quality, that we can't measure in a purely objective way. And Skinner's idea was that this is how we make contact with the world, that this is ultimately the words in the story we put to those animal sensations of our body is how we make sense of the world that we're navigating. So when you label a warm sense of openness around your heart, if that's receiving compassion, and then that gets reinforced by your therapist, that's tacting. If you are able to articulate the experience of your heart feeling closed off and hardened against warmth, when the person that you're working with is responding to you in a way that's either evoking a sense of threat or that you're feeling overwhelmed, that's also tacting. So it's not just a good or a bad practice, but it's how do we dive into cultivating that skill, since many of our clients come with a weak repertoire of tacting. These may be sensations we don't typically pay attention to. If you read like Linehan's manual for DBT, and Linehan attended the University of Washington when FAP was created. Her first edition, anyway, of her manual cites it quite a bit. It was a big influence on DBT. She says part of the invalidating child's environment, and her focus was on borderline personality disorder, but we can apply it broadly to our clients, that the part that gets invalidated is tacting, the part that gets invalidated is also even orienting to those inner experiences. If you're consistently punished for having sensations or experiences that disagree with a caretaker, if it makes it difficult to be around, to be trusting, to be present with your caretaker, if you're paying too much attention to this, then we kind of learn not to. We shift our attention elsewhere. We become hyper-focused on the emotions we read on our partner's face and how they would like us to respond to something. So some of our clients may come, some of us may come to the room with a lot of learning history around not noticing that anyway. And so that's also a place to begin. It may be that doing so is aversive because of that training. And even if it's something positive, it doesn't necessarily mean that that's reinforcing. You've probably had clients you work with who are afraid to get too excited for the next thing coming in life because the other shoe might drop at any moment. So there's not an automatic trajectory of FAPing being reinforcing or not. Tacting skill as a clinician is incredibly important. So much of FAP and so much of labeling CRB 1s and 2s is learning to notice what's the felt sensation I experience when someone's withdrawing from me emotionally? What's the felt experience that I have when someone is opening up to me, is responsive to me? Learning to note that gives us a way to sort of work backwards. In fact, when you have the felt sense, you could either begin to try and track what's going on with the client when this comes up, Or if you're comfortable and confident with it, with the client, just to say, I just felt this experience, which I associate with withdrawing. What did you just notice in that moment? Did you feel yourself pull away? Was there a moment that evoked that in you, that triggered that response? Noticing what happens in the core of your body can help you detect both ones and twos, so it's helpful to cultivate. It can also be a way to model vulnerability. I talked about this earlier this morning, but describing your own tacting process, walking through, whether metaphorically or very literally, depending on how concrete the sensations are in your body. This is what I was feeling. This is the label I'm putting to it. This is how much closer or pulled away I feel from you right now. Modeling this process is a way to help our clients begin to engage in this behavior as well, which can be helpful for their own self-regulation, for their own emotional repertoire. When I shared how much I care about you and you shifted the topic, it felt like a wall went up between my heart and yours. What did you feel? This is a way to model that kind of tacting. I'm going to skip that for now. And so I want to transition to, there are more complicated ways that we can kind of scale up from the basic tacting of an emotion to those sensations that we have associated with parts of ourselves, with ways we move through the world. B.F. Skinner said that, what is a personality but a complex of behaviors defined by habit and stereotypy. So from the FAP view, our character and sense of self anyway is just a complex of the ways that we routinely and stereotypically move through the world. But we would also assume that we have sensations that we tact that correspond to that. And it makes sense if you think about, when you think about the moment you feel like a really competent therapist, that really good moment in session where it feels like you've done the right thing. What are the emotions that go with that? Are there behaviors that go with that? Postures in your body that go with that? Sensations you feel in your body that go with that? Same with if you're feeling like a bad therapist one day. So the exercise we're going to build toward, sort of looking at ways of defining ourselves. A lot of popular therapies today kind of attend to our different inner selves. Compassion-focused therapy spends a lot of time thinking about our compassionate self or critical self. Internal family systems is, I don't know how it is in the UK right now, but in the US it's incredibly popular at the moment, which involves labeling a lot of different parts of the selves and their roles. And behaviorism considers selfing a verb. It's, so self-relevant tacting just makes up a particular type of tacting. It's a way of noticing one of the ways we move through the world. A self at any given moment could be under stimulus control of someone else. What does that mean? Well, think about you go off to grad school, you move away from your parents for the first time, or maybe out of their city. A number of years pass. You go home for the holidays. Your mom makes that comment she does about your weight or about how you're dressed, and you start responding in a certain way that makes you feel embarrassed in front of the date you brought home, or whatever. We all have those cues, those stimulus cues, that take us back, that put us in the mind of another self. So what this exercise is we'll get to is labeled inner voices. This is an exercise that Mavis developed in response to clients diagnosed with dissociative identity disorder. But it gives us an opportunity to practice reinforcing and labeling different components of ourself, different components of our experience of self. Recognizing these shifts in selfing can raise our awareness of what are the contexts where myself, where how I experience myself is under public control. Meaning, there are cues that push me, is it hard when I'm dressed up in a certain way and I'm sitting in my therapy office? Have these become cues that make it difficult for me to feel authentic and vulnerable? What about other places in my life where I have cues that are pushing for me to engage in a certain way, to take on a certain stance toward responsibility, toward emotions? So I'm going to, I moved it from, originally it was going to be tomorrow, but it felt more fun to do today. That's why these are all referring to your homework. It's not your homework, we're going to do it momentarily. So what we're going to do is, I'm going to give out a handout that has some examples. I wonder if, it just takes a second. So what we'll do is I'll ask you to join a partner for a moment, and I want you to consider, just because we'll just do this for a brief time, I'll prompt you after 5 minutes to switch, but I'd like you to ask your partner if they're willing to share with you. Oh, no, this is a deep, I put the different slides back. That's okay. It's, the questions are very similar, which is ultimately, as you look at these selves, what's one that I wouldn't see? What's one that feels underexpressed, under-rehearsed, underseen in your life right now? Or what's a part of yourself that perhaps you miss? What's a part of yourself you never get to talk about? Any of these prompts will do. You don't have to ask every single one. I just want you to pick, or if none of those feel like a fit, it could just be because many of you already have a history with one another today, even if you'd never met before, to ask, what self would you like to share with me? You could simply start there. So again, I'd like you to take an opportunity. This is not like the life histories. You don't have to be silent. I'd like to invite you to consider, as your partner shares with you, what are ways, as you think about holding those FAP rules in mind, of reinforcing vulnerability, authenticity, of evoking. What are the questions or what are the ways you would reinforce the sharing? What are the questions you would ask that could be evocative to learn more? See if you could follow your gut in the way that we talk about with tacting. Where does it resonate that you feel you should be led? Is it to ask about the history of this self? To ask about why this self isn't talked about, or why it felt important? So